Thanks for being here. This is going to be a good conversation. We started it in the green room, so we'll continue it here. I know that people want to talk about ICE, and we'll get to ICE in a few minutes. But before we do, I want to talk with you, Brandon, about what motivates migrants to come to the United States. Because, hi, AIDA. Glad you can make it. Hi.
What's up, guys? Sorry.
Back in April, when there was a migrant caravan coming, there was a lot of upset on the right about why they were coming, and there was a lot of framing around a criminal element. And you were very quick to push back and say that that's not why people come. We have another migrant caravan coming right now. What is it that motivates someone from, let's say, Central America to take their child and make that trek up north?
Yeah, well, first off, I mean, it's not really an either-or situation. There are definitely people who come into the United States to do crimes or to traffic drugs, but the vast majority of people who come here are coming here because of economic reasons, or they're coming here because of issues in their own country that are going on. So if we look at the plight of the average person who comes here to the United States, you're looking at Central American women and children. The average woman from Central America who comes here is either put onto birth control or given morning after pills, right? By aid organizations or by some, it depends on which churches. Some churches help. They come across Mexico. Usually, it depends whose estimates you look at. You can go with Amnesty International, you can go with different UN offices, but up to 70% of migrant women from Central America are sexually assaulted along the way. Depends on whose estimates you look at. They're brought across the U.S.-Mexico border, and usually they're sexually assaulted again in stash houses on the U.S. side. So that is the reality that is going on. The reality is that most people coming here are coming here for economic reasons and for safety reasons. The people who would send their family members, people ask me all the time, and they say, well, what kind of parent would send their daughter to the United States border knowing that there's a chance that there's a 70% chance they're going to be sexually assaulted? And I say, well, the type of parent who realizes that there's a 100% chance their daughter's going to be sexually assaulted if she stays. So things really are that bad in a lot of places in Central America and a lot of places in Mexico south of our border. And our policies, have something to do with why people come as well. But things really are that bad. Most people coming here are not coming here to kill people or to hurt people or sexually assault people. Most people coming here are actually victims of those very things.
So Delegate Guzman, the one thing I know that this panel can agree on across the board is the fact that our current immigration system is not working. It is broken. When it doesn't work at the federal level, what type of pressures and stresses does that put on you at the state level?
Sure. So for example, when we look at the numbers at the state legislation and we compare the first 6 months from 2016 to the first 6 months to 2017, we realize that 90% of the pieces of legislation that are presented are based on closing the immigration loopholes that are created, for example, with DACA. When DACA was created, it was never mentioned whether Dreamers have to pay in-state or out-of-state tuition. So states were challenged trying to figure it out a way to find a quick remedy to that loophole. And that happens all the time, which is unfair because the state policies should be working about budget, transportation, health, education. Immigration shouldn't be discussed at the state policy. And then we have to be talking about topics of sanctuary or anti-sanctuary cities. We have to be talking about in-state or out-of-state tuition for Dreamers or undocumented immigrants. Then we have to talk about driver's license for undocumented immigrants, whether it is fair or not fair to provide with driver's license. And that is not the focus of our role.
Ildefonso, I want to read you the stated mission of ICE. And as a reminder, ICE was established in March 2003. This is still a fairly new department. ICE's primary mission is to promote homeland security and public safety through the criminal and civil enforcement of federal laws governing border control, customs, trade, and immigration. Ildefonso, are they living up to that mission?
Well, you see, here's the interesting part. You cannot talk about immigration, talk about border issues, without realizing that nothing crosses that river, nothing crosses that fence without a cartel saying, go ahead, and that same cartel making money. That is at the base of every immigration issue, is that the real border security is in Mexico, and it's the cartels. They control the border. So when you have agencies in the U.S. that are trying to counter that, are they fighting them? They're trying, but are they being successful? I mean, the cartels are still in operation. So it's an enforcement issue, I guess you could call it. But one of the problems that we're having in Mexico is this. Those cartels, when you think about cartels, you think about a bunch of guys with guns. But the power for the cartels, it comes from politicians in Mexico, attorneys, accountants. The influence that those cartels have in Mexico as a whole, that is what makes those cartels so powerful. So stopping those horrors, because sadly, people...
But do you think ICE is doing what they need to do when it comes to those cartels?
In a way, they have. Now, for example, in Tamaulipas, you have 2 former governors that are wanted in the U.S. for working for those same cartels. 2 politicians in Mexico that are criminally charged in the U.S. And one of them is already in jail over here facing trial. The other one is trying to be extradited. So that is one of the things that ICE actually also targets those cartel bosses and those cartel politicians that are helping those cartels keep the flow of not only illegal immigration, but drugs, weapons. I mean, nothing crosses that border with those cartels.
So what you can't see over your shoulder is that AIDA has an epic eye roll going on. So I want to toss it over to you so that you can respond.
I'm really tired of the immigration narrative continuously being given a brown face. We talk about immigration as if the only people who come to America are coming from Mexico and Central and South America. When people migrate here from all over the world illegally, they come from Eastern Europe, they come from China. What is ICE doing when it comes to them? Because we seem to keep a lot of focus on the cartels and, MS-13. We know why people who come from those countries are coming here, because they're seeking asylum. But why is it that we talk about a wall, we talk about the borders when it comes to Mexico, but what about the other immigrants that come here from all over the world and do come commit crimes and human trafficking and do all kinds of awful things in America? Why do we always continuously focus our conversation about immigration on Latinos and brown people that are coming from those countries? That's what I want to know.
Brendan, do you want to jump in? Because you had sort of touched upon this with me earlier about the difference in how we talk about our Canadian border versus how we talk about our Mexican border.
Right, yeah, so I definitely, first off, I wish we had talked a little beforehand. I know you were on another panel, but we were all getting along seeming like very well, right? We bonded very well. It was very nice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I look forward to bonding with you guys as well.
And I hear your concern. I've thought those things myself. But really, I think what the issue is I think that there are some on both sides who are extreme and crazy. I'm not going to argue that there are not people on the right, my fellow people on the right, who have racial issues. There are those people, obviously. But I don't think that's the majority, just like I don't think the majority of people on the left are crazy or out there as well. I think that when we're talking about the border issues, first off, there's an issue with numbers, right? There's an issue about the numbers of people coming across, but also there's an issue about the circumstances that are existing within those countries where people are coming from. So when we talk about the U.S.-Canadian border, for instance, we're talking about 2 nations that have symbiotic economies where the resources, as much as there obviously is a large gap between the the people in the most need in the United States and the people with the most, we still have a much larger middle class, a stratified economic benefit. When we look at Canada, they are going through that same situation that we're going through. When we look at Mexico, we're talking about a nation that has portions of that nation along our border that are actually under the control of transnational criminal organizations. There are portions of the U.S.-Mexico border that are safe. When Beto O'Rourke says the border is safe, well, that's a half-truth. When Ted Cruz says it's dangerous, that's a half-truth too. Because the fact of the matter is out of the 9 sectors, there are safe areas along our border and there are dangerous areas along our border. There are areas along our border where it is okay and safe in Mexico, and there are areas along our border where it is extremely dangerous right now. So when we talk about the focus on the Mexican border or what's coming across the southern border, it has a lot to do with the systems that are at play on that border. But I do think there's probably some bit of that people focus on because of Brown. I think you're probably right.
I mean, there are some places in Los Angeles that are safe and some places in Los Angeles that are dangerous. So when you pose that, that contention about it being something that's specific to our borders, I just like to the question answered about the people who come here from other parts of the world, not just from Canada. I'm talking about the Eastern Europeans that come here, the Asians that come here. People come from all over the world and they stay. They don't go back. But the focus is always on Latinos. And for me, because I know that your passion is the safety of our people. I understand where that comes from. But I want to know why we continue to neglect the immigration talk from a global perspective. Why do we just focus on this region?
Sorry, you wanted to jump in, Delegate Guzman.
Oh, yes, because I was looking at the numbers actually last night, and it is correct. Most of the illegal immigration is not through the borders. Most of the illegal immigration is from people who come to this country legally with visas, tourist visas, student visas, and overstayed visas, and they are of all type of colors and shapes, not only Latinos. And the same thing in the border. I had the opportunity to visit a detention facility in Phoenix, Arizona. And the first thing that surprised me, because every day on the news, we watch Latino children in cages and detention centers. But when I was there, I saw children from Middle East, I saw Asian children as well as children from Central America. But for some reason, it's always children who look like us that are the portrait and the cover for all of this type of news, which make us feel, all of us, uncomfortable.
Go ahead, Mayra.
So Brandon was alluding to this earlier about, why are migrants coming here? And I think that often when we have this conversation, and in part why the national narrative is often focused on brown faces, is because we talk about it very apolitical. We forget that our country has abetted in some way destabilizing the economies of these Central American countries. And the reason why there's so many people coming from Honduras is because there was a coup in 2009. And our country and our government, whether or not was involved, helped legitimize the coup by equivocating on whether or not it was a coup. And if you look at the numbers post-coup, the violence increased in Honduras, the drug cartels took over, but we're also in compliance with our politicians that our government, either advertently or inadvertently, help legitimize. And so we're seeing droves of Honduran families that are escaping the violence and the crime that our government, again, either inadvertent or advertently, help create.
Myra, can I ask you a question? Because I don't want to equate what the Obama administration did on immigration to what the Trump administration has done. There is not a direct comparison there, what you see with zero tolerance, what you see with family separation. At the same time, the reality of the Obama administration was that there was a surge. That was the word they used at the time. There were more migrants crossing the border. There recently was an entire debacle on social media because there were pictures being tweeted out of children in cages that actually predated the Trump administration, then went back to the Obama administration. The Obama administration officials then came out and said that was an immediate response. The ultimate goal was to place those children with sponsors or with family. That said, hindsight being 2020, Do you now look back at the immigration policies of the Obama administration and think that in some ways it set the groundwork for the immigration policies that we're seeing today?
I think we lost a great opportunity to pass humane immigration reform. And I think in part because Democrats often do this, we come to the table to negotiate. And our version of negotiating is coming to the table with a compromise in mind already. Whereas oftentimes our Republican counterparts come with their bold vision. And so what we often see is that instead of coming to a middle ground, we are losing the status quo. And so part of the Obama administration's immigration policies was to help create a palatable environment so that Republicans were willing to pass immigration reform. And we passed it in the Senate, but it never got to the House, right? And so we made all of these concessions beforehand. We increased deportations, and the Obama administration tried to rectify at some point and said, well, we're going to prioritize those with serious criminal convictions, right? And we're trying to bring humanity to this because realizing that we have missed an opportunity to pass comprehensive immigration reform, these are the things that we are not going to put in place. And what happened, and what we're seeing with the Trump administration, is that they essentially took that status quo and took it even further right, and are really stripping immigrants and migrant families that are seeking asylum of humanity. And why I say this? Well, because yes, there were children that were held in detention centers back when the crisis was first happening in 2014. But what we're seeing now is that the Obama administration changed the priorities and also are now separating families and children because there's a stipulation that children are only allowed to be detained for 20 days. Right, and so what the Obama administration did, and what is often called as catch and release, is we detain these families and we're going to process them, and so then we don't see them till they have to come to our court date. What the Trump administration did to reverse that was saying we're going to just detain everyone, and now are finding themselves without capacity, without enough space at these detention centers. They're rolling back on that and are figuring out, well, what is our recourse now? Are we instead going to give parents the option, this binary choice, where we give parents the option to allow their kids to not be detained because they can only keep them legally for 20 days, but parents are still detained, or do we detain families together? And so, in short, I think that Democrats need to come to the table with much more bolder visions of what is humane and what is just for our community.
Yeah, no, I agree. And what I want to say is that we get really caught up in policy, and when it comes to, there's always the two narratives. There's the one that the people on the left want to just let everybody in, and they want to let the criminals in, right? And then there's the narrative that is people who are on the right are racist and they don't care about, you know, the people. Those of us who are people of color are always a currency in these arguments. We get used by both sides to sell these narratives. And what is at the essence, I think at the nucleus, what's the deepest part of all of this is that we are just asking for humane treatment and to stop the dehumanization of people who are coming here to seek refuge from an already horrific place. And I think that's what continuously frustrates us, because to see the imagery, yeah, Obama deported more immigrants, but Donald Trump has torn children away from their parents. These people are missing. These are human beings that are missing. And to some people, these are bullet points on an agenda. But to somebody, that is a baby that someone went to labor and delivery for, risk their life to bring to the United States in hopes to finding freedom and liberty for that child. And we look at them like animals, and we refer to them as less than. And I think that's what's problematic, because while you have your agendas, everybody has their agendas, we keep forgetting that these are human beings. And that is why some of us get so passionate about it, because we have to stop removing the humanity from that needs to be at the center of the conversation. If we really care about children, then we got to care about them all.
Brendan, given where we are in our state of politics, which is more bifurcated than it's ever been before, what would a starting point for immigration reform look like now? I ask you that as someone who is on the right and is, at this point in time, anomalous in your views about immigration.
Well, so first off, that was very powerful, and I agree with everything that you said, you know, and we're in a bad spot, you know, and to start this off, I think we need to first off remember that 90% of the people on the right who are really angry about immigration right now, like, they lose that part about, remember that unto the least of these, you know, whatsoever you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. I think people forget that part. And I know we're Breitbart, and I know I'm on the right, and I'm Breitbart's border guy, and so I know everyone's like, ah. But the reality is that we don't forget that. Like, we probably more than any other people in media cross into Mexico through all 9 sectors, and we meet with the victims of criminal organizations, the victims of organized crime. That's what we do. And so what we see is a situation where there really are legitimate arguments to be made on both sides of issues right now. There are also some really bad ones. But like, if I were to say, well, I'm not so convinced that it's bad to detain people, people get mad at me. But that's not a racial issue on my part. That's not where that comes from. I think that if people want to come here and they want to work and they want to have a better life, I'm down with it as long as we figure out a way to do it legally, which is not the easiest thing to do for a lot of people, especially the groups who are coming. I'm not an anti-immigration person at all, and I know that my partner ILDEFONSO ORTIZ is not either. But what we see is a situation where some of the most brutal groups in Mexico, like Los Zetas or the Gulf Cartel, they make as much or more from illegal immigration or irregular migration, or whatever we want to call it. They make as much or more from that illicit transportation of people, smuggling of human beings, than they do from drugs at this point. So I can say that if we have policies that encourage people to come, that are pull factors, because it's horrible where they live, if we have those policies, are we not fueling the very systems of oppression that people are fleeing from in the first place?
Can I ask you about that, though? Because, I mean, I think you can talk about legalization and earned path to citizenship, all of those things as being pull factors, when in reality what we've seen for the past 20 years is so long as American businesses are willing to hire people at something that does not approximate a living wage, then there will always be a pull factor, even if there is no earned path to legalization or citizenship.
100%.
Right? Like the pull doesn't need to be codified by the U.S. government so long as you don't crack down on private businesses.
Well, but it is kind of, it might not be codified, but it is a de facto policy. Like, what we see is we see people, it's like I say this all the time. Trump tweeted something the other day, and he said, he basically, they focus and they point fingers at the caravan, at the people in the caravan. And I said, wait a minute, like, don't blame the people in the caravan. They're just coming here because of your policies and our policies, and because of our de facto, the realities of people coming here. To demonize the people coming here is easier to do than to actually hold the Republicans and Democrats accountable who have allowed this mess to happen in the first place. And I'm all about that. I get what you're saying, and I get what you're saying. But the reality is that we have to honestly look at what's occurring. How many of you realize that, what is it, over 32 journalists this year? Is it?
In the last 3 years, there's been about 38 journalists killed in Mexico.
And some people have different numbers on that. Like, the Committee to Protect Journalists will say something different, because we talk about all media workers, right? Whether they're videographers or photographers, writing about the corruption in the cartels, but have been murdered. But most U.S. outlets never, the Washington Post, and I'm not knocking on the Post, I'm not knocking on anyone, but most U.S. outlets don't even report it when a Mexican journalist is murdered.
So can I ask then, is what I'm hearing from you, and ILDEFONSO, perhaps you can pick this up, is that there is no way to talk about in your view, that there's no way to talk about comprehensive immigration reform without first tackling corruption vis-a-vis the Mexican government?
Well, so the problem is this. When you want to talk about fixing something along the border of Mexico, you have to realize that most governors in Mexico, in the border states and in the central part of Mexico, are taking money from organized crime. The Mexican president, the outgoing one, his campaign was linked to drug cartels. So when you realize that and you want to find a way to have Mexico pull their weight as far as dealing with these issues, you have a problem because they have no real interest in fixing this. It's all about optics. Peña Nieto's entire presidency in Mexico has been about presenting an image of trying to say nothing bad is happening in Mexico, which is the furthest thing from the truth. We have a humanitarian crisis in Mexico with the violence, the horrors that migrants go through in Mexico. I'm talking about incinerations, mass graves, thousands of people that go missing. Many of them are migrants. And the problem is that Mexico has refused to address this in a real way. So before, we can talk all about trying to come to an answer in the US, but until we hold the Mexican government accountable for their side of this problem, nothing is going to be fixed.
We got to hold our government accountable first before we start talking about going in. Our government takes bribes from corrupt and criminal organizations as well. And I think it's, and listen, when you hear about, we don't hear about the journalists that are Latinos who are murdered because they don't matter, just like the immigrants don't matter because the brown people don't matter. But you do hear about the young white girl that was murdered by the immigrant because that is used to demonize immigrants. And so we have to remember, we got to continue to remember who's telling the stories. And a lot of stories that are being told about us are just part of the story. They're lies. They're not the whole, they're not the whole story about who we are. There are a lot of people that have come to this country illegally that have contributed to this economy and to this continuously doing jobs like you hear the argument all the time that nobody wants to do. But I think that until we start having the honest, comprehensive conversation about immigration that includes all immigrants, we are still doing a disservice to a group of people because we keep talking about immigration with regards to only Latinos. And I think that has to stop. We got to continue. We got to talk about everybody who comes here illegally. It is just racist to always give immigration a brown face, and it has to stop. It has to stop, man.
So Delegate Guzman, when you think about comprehensive immigration reform, where do you think we are?
I think that is possible. I agree with AIDA that we don't have to wait on the Mexican government to act because they'll never will, and it wouldn't matter to us. We have to think about the 11 million people who are living in this country, who are contributing to drive the economy of this country. And we're talking about that at least 50+% of these undocumented immigrants have children who were born in this country. And if their children are American, I believe that they deserve a path to permanent residency, because we also talk about a path to citizenship. And for people who don't understand the system, they may think that this happens overnight, and that is not accurate. A path to citizenship, it takes you at least about 10 years. It takes you about 10 years, and you have to behave according to the law in order to be provided the opportunity to become American citizen. And we don't talk about those things. We don't talk about that many of those undocumented immigrants who live in this country are afraid. They have a path to become legal in this country because maybe their wives are American or their siblings or their parents, but now the law establishes that they need to go back to their countries to receive their green card to come here, and they're afraid that once they leave this country, they have to wait for 10 years or more to come back. So all of this fear we need to get rid of, and the only way to get rid of that is, number one, recognizing how much immigrants contribute to the economy of this country, that they are Americans and they deserve the right to path to lockup to permanent residency.
Mayra, you said earlier that Democrats often come to the table already with a compromise. So what would it look like to have a truly just democratic, progressive vision of immigration?
We're going there. I think that the folks who are campaigning on Abolish ICE are coming in with a very bold vision without making concessions. And whether or not that's practical, they're coming to the table with a bold vision that is humane, that takes into account the way that this administration has, while deporting less people, has made it a show of sorts, right? Has very visibly deported folks coming into their homes while they're mowing their lawns, who don't have a criminal record, whose only criminal record is driving without a license, which guess what? You can't do in many cities or municipalities if you're undocumented, coming into their homes and arresting them. And so we are depriving folks of their humanity by these very visible acts that are meant to incite fear in the rest of the community. And so what happens is that individuals no longer trust the very systems that are in place to protect us. Folks are not going to the hospitals anymore because now they're scared that the hospitals are in compliance with ICE, or there were reports of trucks, ICE trucks lurking around courthouses. There are less folks actually reporting domestic abuse because of all of the fear and tension that's been created, again, with these very systems that are meant to protect us. ICE was created to keep Americans safe domestically, and the paradox is that it is inciting fear and terror in our communities, and the trauma doesn't just impact immigrants or undocumented immigrants, it impacts all of us that live in those communities and learn to grow up with a resentment of police, a resentment of these municipal organizations that, again, are meant to keep us safe.
Abolish ICE.
Well, this is the part where I hope we can all still get along, but this is where I'm going to have to say some things. Okay, remember earlier I was talking about how some politicians on the right will point fingers at the caravans and the people who are really just utilizing the laws that are on our books, you know? And how I thought it was unfair of Republicans to do that because it's basically saying, no, let's make you angry at them so you don't look at my own failures as a lawmaker. So I'm gonna make people mad, but when it comes to the Democrats and the focus on ICE, I think that's the same situation. I think that Democrats also, you know, you had Obama, you had 2009 and 10 where Democrats could have changed laws, but they didn't, right? They focused on other things. They focused on health care, that's okay. But they didn't prioritize immigration reform when they could have. So really what you have right now is you have laws that are on the books that are being enforced. That's a big division in our country between left and right. We talk about rule of law. I understand that a lot of people talking about rule of law, I see that can be a big cop-out.
Can I just jump in here though and say, is it about rule of law or is it about the nuance within rule of law, which is to say that if you are prioritizing and there is a de facto prioritization, you are at some point entrusting a wing of the government to honor that prioritization.
But what I'm trying to say is that both parties have fault in what's going on right now, and the focus on ICE and making you angry at ICE, like ICE did it. No, they're not. They're enforcing the laws as they're being told to.
So then who should we be angry at?
We should be angry at our lawmakers on both sides and their funders, right? That's why, like with the Republicans, the reason it doesn't get through is because most of the funders in Texas for the Republican candidates are builders, and they have business models based upon the exploitation of undocumented labor. That's why they don't allow immigration reform to happen. And it's the same situation on the left for different reasons, but just like the Republicans point fingers and get you angry at somebody to divert the attention and the blame that should be on themselves, I think Democrat leadership does that too sometimes.
That doesn't make me angry. I agree with you. I think both sides pimp people of color. I don't think that it's exclusive to the Republicans. I think people of color have been pimped by both parties for years, for centuries. We have always been, you know, a pawn in the game. And I do think that, you know, that there have been opportunities for there to be progress, and people bite their noses to spite their faces. But what I refuse to ignore is the systemic issue, the systemic racism that exists, that is trickle down from these governments, that trickle down into law enforcement, because law enforcement is also, including ICE, the pawns in the game. This systemic issue that we refuse to address that is really about people of color in this country.
Can you break it down what you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm just saying that, you know, we get into these fights about law enforcement, the ICE, the policemen, the police officers who wrongfully kill people who are unarmed. We see that. We talk about ICE abusing their power. But what we don't address, it's what's above that, because what's above that is what really is the problem, right? It's the systemic issue that continues to feed that race that we are demanded to run in equally to people who have the tools to win the race, who got the head start. They tie our arms and our legs behind our backs and they say, catch up. And that is what we continue to ignore. And yes, you're right, both parties pimping people of color. That nobody can be more condescending than a liberal who thinks they're coming to save people of color. It is the most condescending thing on the planet. Nobody denies that. None of us deny that. But what we cannot continue to deny is that there is an issue because of this, that we can't camouflage, which is what we keep ignoring. And that is where my issue is. I don't disagree with you about the political parties. They're being negotiated at the highest level right now, and those of us who are not in the top 1% will be the ones who perish. And this is an issue about money and the people in the pockets of the politicians. But when are we going to get down to the nitty-gritty and really say, you know what? This party that I belong to, yours and mine alike, we need to clean house. And we need to really be honest about the people that we're dealing with, because they're causing all of us the drama and they're living their best lives. And you can't ignore that.
That's why you gotta elect more people like Elizabeth.
Yes.
I am curious. I mean, I think there's a question of whether or not there's an appetite to deal with this, period. I think there's particularly a question of who is positioned on the right to approach this in a way that is compassionate, that goes back to sort of the George Bush ethos around this question. So I know that you are not fans of lawmakers in general, but are there people that you would point to and say, if Dems want to come, because I want to read you this tweet from Trump. He said, I think this was yesterday, if the Democrats would stop being obstructionists and come together, we could write up and agree to new immigration laws in less than 1 hour. It's not how laws work. Look at the needless pain and suffering that they are causing. Look at the horrors taking place at the border. And then my favorite, Chuck and Nancy, call me. So it's not about Chuck and Nancy calling Donald Trump, because that is not a conversation that is going to be constructive. So then who should Chuck and Nancy be calling?
Well, they should probably call me. That's what they should do. You know, honestly, it's very difficult because we live and breathe the border region. We look at the border as in a holistic way, right? That you can't understand the border if you don't understand the north side and the south side, if you don't understand the reasons that a lot of communities along the border don't want more border security. If you present it as that's because they're all corrupt, no, it's because they have a community, they have a sister community across the river or across the border, and things have went south for that sister community, and they're not in a place yet where they want something that finalizes and formalizes that community is now divided because of crime and because of economic situations. If you can't know these things and have an understanding of all of the facts involved and all of the perspectives involved, you can't make good policy. And I don't see anyone on the right or the left who is actually presenting themselves as though they know what the hell is happening on the border and what the components are. It's very disturbing to me. So I don't feel very hopeful right now. I'm happy anytime any politician mentions the border, even though they do it in a deficient way.
I think, though, you're sort of underlining AIDA's point, which is that when we talk about immigration, it always comes back to our southern border.
Absolutely. And the funny thing is, what Donald Trump tweeting that is that respectability politics is just so amazing when it comes to us, to blame people for their own oppression and to say, look how horrible this is, look what's happening to them, as if he is not responsible for those babies being torn away from their parents and put in those cages. Like, where is the responsibility in that? It's like, shame on you guys for making me do this to you.
We now can actually open this up to Q&A. So there is a mic in the center over there. Please make sure that your question has a question mark at the end of it.
My question is about the issue about governors in northern Mexican states. For the first time, we had a leftist win for president in Mexico since the '88 election was stolen. Do you think it's going to be different once AMLO takes office?
Absolutely not. All that we have in Mexico was that this ruling party switched jerseys.
You got to like really eat the mic, unfortunately. Yeah,
So
there you go.
absolutely not. All we have in Mexico is that the ruling party, the same operators, they just switched their jerseys, but it's the same group of people that have been in power all this time. They're back in power.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Kimo Gandol. So I'm asking, how can you say that illegal aliens don't cost the system money if under the Obama administration, the Congressional Budget Office found that these people take over $100 billion out of the system every year through taking advantage of our social services such as healthcare and education? Shouldn't we be having an America First policy?
Where are you getting your facts from, baby?
The Congressional Budget Office.
What is your, first of all, illegal aliens, or are you talking about undocumented humans? Which one?
So,
Okay.
I'm sorry
I
you
don't
don't understand the law, but they're called illegal aliens according to the statutes defined in the federal
I've heard
code.
that argument a lot throughout this entire convention. I do understand the law. I also understand that I'm standing on the soil that belonged to natives, that was stolen by people who did not honor the law when they were raping, pillaging, and stealing a country that did not belong to them, while we're still standing on part of what was Mexico. So when you take that pompous attitude, young man, and you refer to human beings, which is what we were discussing with people who are even on your side, who do not believe in the dehumanization of people of color,
So
I
do
would
not
say to
believe
you,
in the nation state, like the fundamental premise.
Can we actually, so I think at the core
What
of
is
the
not a
question,
race?
the piece of it that I would love for someone to
Illegal is
talk
not a
with
race.
is about sales tax and the many other ways that immigrants contribute to the U.S. economy.
Sure, absolutely. He was referring to social services. And here we go again about the misconception. To be eligible to social services, you need to be a documented citizen of this country.
Absolutely.
So anytime you see this on the news, it's a lie. That is not true. And the second thing is when we talk about people who are paying taxes or stealing taxes. So my question is going to be, what is going to happen to these streamers who are paying taxes to a system that they will know what will happen to their future? They are paying Medicare, they are paying Social Security number, the same thing with TPS holders that are paying for 15 years to a system that they will never know what will happen with that money. But now we say, you know what? You pay taxes to this country and now we're going to say goodbye. And by the way, we're going to use your money to drive the economy of this country. And I think that is unfair.
yeah, I would like to know what this country, you speak about these undocumented people. What would happen to this economy if everybody who you consider undocumented went home? It would crash. Go ahead, sir. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Yes, I live in East Los Angeles, and I have a lot of brown Mexican neighbors. And my neighbor is Sal's Chicharrones, and the mom gets up early in the morning and she, makes the food. And the grandfather goes out during the day and he pushes that car all day long. And I've seen ICE chase this old man. I've seen him chase him. And I've been on the metro bus and riding the bus, and the bus literally pulls over when someone gets on and says, ICE is up the street, ICE is coming. And I see mothers with babies running. I have neighbors where I hear a Mexican woman getting beat up by her husband, and it's horrifying. And I go to try to help her, and she tells me, please don't call the police, please. What can I do as a man of love and concern for my immigrant brothers and sisters? What can I do for them when ICE is chasing them down?
I think part of it is telling these stories, right? We get a very one-sided image of what is happening in our country, and you being able to uplift those stories helps substantiate the things that we've been saying, because we've been saying that there's a lack of trust because of the terror and trauma, and it doesn't just affect undocumented people, right? It affects folks who are part of that community. I think telling and uplifting those stories, and also the political in me, is you need to advocate for reform with your local elected officials, with your congressional members, because until there is momentum, and this again, I'm coming back to the Abolish ICE thing, the only reason why I keep bringing up Abolish ICE is because we weren't talking about immigration reform before Alexandria, before Sean tweeted the hashtag Abolish ICE. Now 1 in 4 Americans believes in abolishing ICE. This is a conversation that wasn't happening, right? Because it gets relegated to brown and black people, and we are often the ones having the conversation internally. And the fact that it is being brought to the forefront, the fact that we're having this conversation now, that even moderate Democrats are having to take a side on this is hopeful for me. And as long as we continue to uplift those stories and talk about how ICE, again, that is supposed to keep our community safe, is the one agency, the one law enforcement agency that doesn't have to report to the Department of Justice. Like, why is it that the one law enforcement agency that is dealing with these folks does not have to report to the Department of Justice, but the FBI does, the DA does? This is ludicrous.
And I would say, I agree, I would say vote. Register to vote. Go into the community and the people who look like us and help them register to vote. Vote in your best interest. Vote and inform yourself about the local officials and where they stand with these issues that directly affect our communities. That is how you stand up for your immigrant brothers and sisters. We have to exercise our right to vote. We have so many of our ancestors who lost their lives so that we could have the right to vote. So we have to we can't take it lightly. We got to be repetitive, and we got to keep reminding people that they need to vote collectively. Latinos have to think like a unit.
I have a question. Do you know anything about this caravan of 5,000 that's supposedly heading our way? It seems suspicious, like perhaps Trump sent them to us to excite his core, the core base, you know? Is there anything that isn't being covered in the news that you might know?
Well, it's also, and it's not the first time this happened. So a similar caravan happened in April, and and people feel free to chime in. There are several organizations that help organize these because it is very unsafe to trek from Honduras all the way to the United States. And so the idea behind the caravan is that you are traveling in numbers, and so that if you're a woman, you're not, you know, at the risk of being assaulted. If you are a mother traveling with your younger children, there's safety in numbers. And so that is the sort of origin story of the caravan. It is obviously being very politicized, and part of what is not being part of that, or part of that narrative that is missing, is that a lot of these folks are coming from countries where they can seek asylum. So it's not like they're coming here illegally, right? They have a right to seek asylum, again, for the very reasons that we discussed earlier, that we have in some way abetted the destabilization of their governments. They have the right to seek asylum. And so it is obviously being very politicized. I'm sure you all saw that Trump tweeted to the various governments saying that, you know, it is incumbent upon them to stop them from crossing the border, or else aid is going to be withheld from these countries.
Hi. Is there any hope for coming to common ground on this issue by focusing on data and numbers? And if so, are there any particular data sets or numbers that you would point to for people on either side, any political party, on this issue?
I think the numbers that I was sharing earlier is that we get this misconception about most of the illegal immigration to this country comes through the borders. I would invite everybody to go and check the facts. The facts are that most of the undocumented immigrants are overstaying visas, or are students who have their visas and overstay their visas. So we have to find a way to find common ground on that subject and find a way of whether provide an opportunity to these individuals to contribute to this economy and allow them to stay if they are good citizens, if they are not criminals.
And can I just quickly add, I feel like if we cannot find common ground, given just the human nature of what is happening, then I don't think any data set is going to help us, right? Like, we see what is happening, we see the images. Everyone on this stage agrees that something has to be done, and we come from different sides of the ideological spectrum. Why do we agree on this? Because we see the effects, right? The folks here on the border see what happens, the travesty and sort of the trials and tribulations folks have to endure on this arduous journey. And so if we cannot find common ground on human conditions and these human images and stories, I don't think data is going to save us.
Hi, I'm Annabelle, and I am from Chicago, like you.
Yes.
And a huge part of the contributors in Chicago are Mafia members. So Chicago itself is built by the Mafia. New York was built by the Mafia. So let's not go so far to say cartels are building up their own political people. But I do have a question. I wonder if there's hope for ICE. Is there hope to reform it and make it better? Because our current immigration laws are maybe 50 years old. They keep on changing. We need to change it now. Is there hope?
I'm going to somewhat address that. First off, when we talk about cartels, what we have occurring in the United States and what is occurring in certain places in Mexico, like Michoacan, Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Coahuila, there's nothing comparable in the United States as to the abject and direct, irrefutable oppression that people are living under in those states. Right now, all of the news outlets have someone called a link who works for the cartel, and they determine what people can and can't write, which politicians they can and can't write about in a supportive way. So first off, that regardless of historical issues in Chicago, what's currently happening there right now does need to be told, and it needs to be told in order for us to all sit down and have an honest conversation. One of the things that I see, just like Republicans right now, like you see people like even Donald Trump did this, where he tweets out that look at the opioid crisis, we need to build the wall. Well, the facts and the data, to go to another man's question earlier, are that 89% of the opiates coming into the United States don't even come across the border between ports of entry. They come through trucks and through vehicles. And border security, even if you build the wall to the moon, is not going to stop or impact that opiate crisis. Not at all. Most fentanyl, according to, it's the DEA's the latest national drug threat assessment from the DEA. They have a transportation section in there, and it tells you how all of these substances come into our country. And none of these problems are going to be solved by the wall. There are some areas where I support a barrier, but not for those reasons. And what Republicans do right now is they have this anger and this upsetness about what's happening on the border or with immigration, and they focus on these couple of little things as some milepost or some victory or trophy, that if they could just get that, it'll all be better. And I see the left doing that right now when it comes to ICE. Really what's going to happen is in California, maybe that flies, but in Texas, we have a lot of moderate Democrats who had a really good chance until they started talking about abolishing ICE. And if you think that you're going to win general elections across the country talking about abolishing ICE, you might win it in California. You're not going to win it in my state, which is a pretty significant state when it comes to the Electoral College as well, right? When it comes to a number of issues. So you're not going to win with those things. And so I see the right and the left, it's my perspective, that they're both doing these things and they're focusing on these little aspects as though there's some victory. The reality is, whether you abolish ICE, before ICE and after ICE, there's going to be an agency in the U.S. who is going to go after people who are here illegally or undocumented, whatever terms you want to use. That's going to be there, and it's not really going to impact and affect the lives of most people coming here and who are here illicitly.
We have time for one more question.
Hello, my name is Ulises, and I'm an undocumented immigrant. If anyone wants to talk to me about it, go ahead. But my question is more about the dreamer narrative and being a person that fits that narrative. How do I go about, humanizing people who don't fit that narrative? Because I'm seen as like, oh, he's going to school, this is what immigration's all about. But when in reality, there's people like my parents who are working hard every single day just to make that happen. They never see the back product of like what goes into me going into university. So how do I humanize, how do I use my privilege of being this dreamer to help, people who don't necessarily fit that, and help other people who don't understand what it's like to be an immigrant, know what the other side of, immigration is like?
I would say that you have a powerful story. And there are many Americans that are ready to listen to your story and see that you are not a violent person, that you are a regular human being. And there is great opportunity to share your message. We have an election coming. So if you knock on doors and share your story to those people and let them know who you are and what good immigration reform means for you and your parents, I think you will be able to help many people in this country.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Let's hear it for our panel.